Okay, thank you so much. Okay, thank you, Stephen. So just to start, thank you for the introduction. So I'm going to talk about this COVID-19 and youth well-being in South Africa based on a survey that was done during the hard lockdown, which were in level 5. So I'll just start by a small introduction where we see that the pandemic adversely affected almost everyone, where we see that it caused severe problems in terms of physical health and mental health. Many people have died and many people have actually been affected by the disease. Then when you go onto the labor market, we actually see that the labor market shocks due to this pandemic led to these huge income and job losses. It also led to these disruptions in education and training for young people. And existing evidence actually point that the pandemic has hit severely the most vulnerable groups in many countries, and these include the young people who were already in a difficult position before the lockdown. For example, when you look at South Africa, we had about 7 million youth who were already in income poverty, 4.6 million who were unemployed, and about 10 million were already NEET before the COVID-19 pandemic. So just try and gauge and understand the impact of the pandemic on young people's lives. SALDRU, together with UNICEF and many other partners that you see there, conducted an online survey where participants self-selected to participate in this survey. And in the end, at the end of the survey, we actually had a total of about 11,700 participants aged 18 to 35. So based on this survey, what I'm going to talk about today is more to do with the labor market outcomes and the mental health issues that youth experienced during the COVID-19 related lockdown. And a start to just one of the questions that we asked in this survey related to the main activities that youth were doing before the lockdown. And we see that about 30% of the youth were actually unemployed. And I think it just highlights the sort of the dire situation that youth were in even before the lockdown, where the majority of them were actually unemployed, followed by those who were in schooling, 19%, then formal employment and tertiary education. But when we look at these activities in aggregate form, we actually see that 34% were in education, 26% were employed. And of those who were employed, 50% were in formal employment. And these are the ones that I'm going to talk about in the next few slides, because we wanted to see what has been the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic lockdown on those who were in formal employment. And we asked two specific questions, one related to their payment status during the lockdown, and another one which related to their employment status soon after the lockdown or beyond the lockdown. This is the first picture that we get. The first pie chart is looking at the payment status of participant youth during the lockdown. And what we see is about almost 46% of the participants actually highlighted that they were no longer being paid during the lockdown. And I think this actually highlights the huge sort of impact of the income shock that just happened due to this COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdown. We also have another 25% who are no longer being paid in full. And when you look at the employment status after lockdown, here we wanted to understand, going forward, are these youth still going to have their jobs, or they'll no longer be having their jobs? And we actually see that 24% actually highlighted that they'll no longer be having their jobs beyond the lockdown. And highlighting that 30% that we saw, it actually points to us that in the near future, youth unemployment is likely to actually increase. We actually have another 41% there who actually highlighted that they didn't really know, just pointing to the insecurities that youth actually have and uncertainties about the COVID-19 pandemic, to say going in the future, they don't really know whether they'll still be employed or not. But looking at this sort of aggregate picture, what is interesting is to disaggregate it and look at among different youth characteristics, because what you know is most probably, even if youth have greatly been affected, the impact has not been uniform to all youth. So we try to disaggregate by various youth characteristics. And the first thing that we do is we look at the wage distribution itself, where we are looking at payment and employment status by wage quintile. And what we see is, by just looking at these two sort of histograms, in a way, if I can call them that, we see that the bulk of the youth who were no longer being paid during lockdown were actually concentrated in the bottom two quintals, like our second quintile there and our lower quintile, which actually accounts for about 54%. Then when you look at those who will no longer be employed after lockdown, we actually see that the bottom two quintals actually account for about 64% as well. And these are huge losses in terms of income and jobs for the youth who were already vulnerable before lockdown, because these were earning very low incomes before lockdown. And once the lockdown actually started, we actually see that they are the same youth who have been greatly affected. But when you look at the top two quintals, like the upper quintile and the fourth quintile, we actually see that less than 30% of those youth there lost their income or their jobs. And even worse, when you look at the upper quintile, where less than 10% actually lost their jobs or income. And when we try to look at other youth characteristics that I didn't present here, we actually see that the youth were severely affected by this in terms of the payments and employment, when those were Black, female, and those with low education, and those residing in informal settlement. So these were the youth were significantly affected by the lockdown that was implemented. And the interesting thing about our results is that our results are actually collaborated by other findings, like the Needs CREM survey, which is a national survey, which is nationally representative. But when you look at our survey, participants actually self-selected, so it's not representative nationally. But the interesting point is that our findings are actually aligned in the same line with those that have been found by other studies that have used the national representative study. Next thing that we look at is to look at payment and employment status by sector of employment. Here we just wanted to see the youth who lost their jobs or income, which sectors are they concentrated in? What we see is, like, for payment status, they were concentrated mainly in general work, retail, trade, and construction. And these actually account for almost half of the people who lost their jobs, and those who were no longer being paid during the lockdown. And I think what is worrying about these sectors is that these are the top three sectors as well that actually pay the lowest average salaries when you look at average salaries that youth were earning before the lockdown. So it's continuing to highlight the point that the same youth who were sort of in a disadvantaged position and vulnerable before the lockdown in terms of the low wages, they are the same workers who have actually lost their jobs and also lost income during the COVID-19 pandemic. And the next slide will talk about, we try to look at payment status and employment status in terms of whether the job is secure or insecure. And what the graph simply shows is that those youth who were in insecure jobs were the ones who were significantly affected by the COVID-19 pandemic lockdown, where we see, for example, if we look at those who were no longer being paid and we just compare those in full-time work and part-time work, we actually see about 59% of those who were in part-time employment were no longer being paid, compared to about 41% of those who were in full-time jobs. And for those who will no longer be employed after lockdown, we see that those in part-time, about 66% will no longer be employed, compared to 34% of those who are in full-time. So without going further into the other different categories of employment types, where we have whether one is in limited duration contract or in a permanent contract, the conclusion from this chart is that when we look at those who are in insecure jobs, they are the ones who were no longer being paid during the lockdown, and they are the same people who are likely to lose their jobs after the sort of sum it up and see what explains these huge income and job losses that have been experienced by young people. Your internet connection is unstable. I hope you can hear me, all of you.
We can, Gibson. You break up a little bit every now and then, but I can hear you on my side.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. So we try to provide an explanation of the income and job losses that have been experienced by participants. And what we see is that as opposed to the traditional individual characteristics like race, gender, and education that generally explain labor market outcomes, the income and job losses that have been experienced during the lockdown are actually explained by job characteristics, the sector that one is employed in and the job contract that one actually holds. And for sector of employment, I think this is, expected given that the measures that were implemented for the social distance, they affected certain sectors and not all the sectors. So that is expected. Then when it comes to jobs, as companies try to rationalize and react to the shocks, the ones who were actually in insecure jobs were the ones who actually lost their jobs first as compared to those who were in secure employment. So this was generally all about the labor market outcomes in terms of the youth who participated in this survey. But the next thing that we do is to try to look at the emotional well-being of youth who participated in the survey. And what we see is from the 11,700, 5,693 responded to the emotional well-being questions that were asked. In our survey, we asked 10 questions for emotional well-being, where 8 were related to, they were about negative emotional well-being, and 2 were about positive emotional well-being. So each bar there represents a particular question that we asked. So if I'm to go to the first bar, which is talking about, ask youth about the question of how they felt in terms of did they felt bothered or not, up to the point where we asked the question, the last one, where did they feel happy or not? And it was rated differently, where the blue bars are showing someone felt bothered for less than a day, and the purple bars are showing that someone felt bothered for 5 to 7 days. And when you look at the first 8 bars, what we can actually conclude is that a significant proportion of youth actually felt negative emotional well-being during this lockdown, where if we look, let's say, could not get going, which I felt a lot during the lockdown myself, where you couldn't really get going in a lot of things that you try to do. About 44% of those youth felt they could not get going. And another 35% felt they felt lonely. About 35% again felt bothered. But when you try to look at the positive emotional questions that we asked, about 33% felt hopeful for at least 5 to 7 days. But when you try to look at those who felt happy, we only have 18% who felt happy 5 to 7 days, meaning that almost half of the youth were happy for less than a day. And this chart is just communicating to us like the huge impact the pandemic actually had on young people's emotions in terms of how they felt. And when we take these emotions together and try to come up with sort of an index, what we actually found is that at least 72% of the youth actually felt depressed during this COVID-19 lockdown. And this percentage of 72% is significantly high compared to what is found in other studies that have been done during the normal periods. But interestingly, another study that was done by, I've forgotten the name, another institute in South Africa during the lockdown actually found also a very high proportion of people who participated in that survey that were also depressed and felt anxiety, which confirms the study which confirms also our study. Then you look at these depressive symptoms, we actually saw that they were significantly high among female participants, those who were older and those with higher education and those living in informal settlement. And the outcome for higher education, I think, is a bit interesting given that in normal periods, education actually acts as a cushion in terms of most of these negative impacts that one can actually feel. But in this case, we actually see that those who are educated are actually feeling more anxiety, are more depressed. And existing studies have tried to explain this in terms of most probably the fact that they are worried about the disruption of their future plans that are due to this COVID pandemic and the uncertainty about their future that is happening compared to those who have low education. And when you try to explain these depressive symptoms, what you actually see is that high depressive symptoms were actually significantly associated with being female, being older, having higher education, and residing in informal settlement. And for female, it's an outcome that is generally found in the literature even before the pandemic, where females are generally more sort of depressed compared to their male counterparts. Then in terms of low depressive symptoms, they were associated with being employed and offering family care. And for employment, I think it's also expected given the space that we are in, where most people were losing their jobs, and those who remained on the jobs, I think they have the reason not to be depressed compared to others. So I think this is all that I had to say in terms of the mental health issues. And to just conclude my presentation, what we see is our findings point to huge income and job losses among participants. And these participants were those who were already vulnerable before the lockdown. I think the three charts that I showed, they actually pointed clearly that those who were in vulnerable position before the lockdown, they are the same youth who have actually been affected during this current lockdown. And these job losses are not driven by, they're actually driven by job characteristics as opposed to individual characteristics that are usually known to drive labor market outcomes. Then in terms of the mental health issues, we have this youth actually experienced low levels of emotional well-being, where we recorded a percentage of about 72% of youth were feeling depressed during the lockdown. And in terms of just sort of trying to look at policy regarding our research, what you actually see is that most of there is need for a solid social security system that kicks in as soon as jobs are threatened, given the huge number of youth that actually lost their jobs and income during the pandemic. And also, I think there is need for more secure jobs for youth that are actually work in terms of better condition, given the results that we found where most youth were in these insecure jobs were the ones who actually lost their jobs and income. Then policymakers, I think they also need to pay attention to the mental health problems that youth face during and even beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. And since failure to sort of address these problems, what we found is a 72% of youth were signs of depression. And if not addressed, this can actually turn out into significant mental health problems that can have a longer impact on the youth and might have an impact on their reconnection to education and employment in the future.